Welcome to EV Story Vault. And three men were drifting through space when the sound came. Not an alarm. Not a warning. Just a dull metallic bang, the kind that tells you something has already gone wrong. In that moment, the mission was over, but survival had just begun. No rescue was coming. No second chances existed. Every breath depended on numbers, not hope. Power was bleeding away. Oxygen was escaping into the void. And between them and home stood silence cold and one unforgiving question. Can the human mind outthink failure when the universe has already made its decision? And the year was 1970, and the world believed space travel had become routine. Rockets landed and rose again. Confidence had replaced fear. The moon was no longer a mystery, it was a destination. And that belief, that dangerous belief, was quietly orbiting Earth alongside three men who trusted their machines more than the silence beyond them. And they were not reckless men. They were trained, disciplined, and prepared down to the smallest checklist. Every switch had a reason. Every wire had been tested. They sat inside a spacecraft, packed with technology wrapped in layers of metal thinner than human certainty. Outside there was nothing, no air, no sound, no forgiveness. And 2 days into the mission, when Earth had already shrunk into a fragile blue memory, something went wrong. And not dramatically at first, no alarms screaming. No explosions tearing the ship apart, just a sound, a dull metallic bang. The kind of sound that does not belong in space, the kind of sound that tells you the universe has noticed you. And a tank exploded, and in an instant power began draining away. Oxygen, life itself, started bleeding into the void. The spacecraft designed to carry men to the moon was no longer capable of keeping them alive. The mission was over, but survival had just begun. And the moon was still ahead of them, close enough to see, far enough to mock them. Turning back was not simple. There was no reverse gear in space. No rescue ship waiting nearby. No second chance. Only physics, mathematics, and time running out. And on Earth, engineers stared at screens that suddenly meant everything. Numbers weren't data anymore, they were heartbeats. Every calculation was a gamble between hope and disaster. Every decision had to be made without hesitation, yet hesitation was human. And up there, the three men floated in near darkness. Power was shut down to conserve what little remained. Cold crept in, not like weather, but like a presence. Condensation formed on the walls. Water dripped where it shouldn't. Carbon dioxide levels rose silently, invisibly waiting to suffocate them while the stars watched. And they had to abandon their main ship and crawl into a smaller module, never designed to support three men for long. It was meant to be used for landing on the moon, not as a lifeboat in deep space. It was like surviving a shipwreck by climbing into a raft built for two. And the universe does not care about intentions. It does not care about courage. It only responds to precision. And back on Earth, a room full of people refused to accept failure. They had no luxury of emotion. They were given one rule. Use only what the astronauts already had. No new tools, no miracles. Just ingenuity squeezed out of desperation. And carbon dioxide was rising. Filters didn't fit. Time was disappearing. So they built a solution out of scraps, plastic bags, duct tape, cardboard. Not in space, but on Earth, racing against the same clock. They sent the instructions up line by line, trusting that human intelligence could outrun death. And it worked. And the spacecraft swung around the far side of the moon, using its gravity not as a destination, but as an escape. For a brief moment, all communication was lost. Three men vanished behind the moon, unseen, unheard, surrounded by cold rock and endless night. The world held its breath, because no signal meant no certainty. And when they reemerged, the signal returned, weak, scratchy, but alive. And now came the hardest part, re-entry, and the heat shield had been damaged. No one knew how badly. If it failed, the ship would burn like a falling star, a brief flash of light, marking the place where hope had ended. Radio silence during re-entry was normal, but now it felt like a verdict being delayed. And seconds stretched into eternities. Engineers stared, families waited. A planet listened, and then a voice, and they were alive. And not because everything went right, but because enough people refused to let it end wrong. Because human beings, when stripped of comfort and certainty, can still think, still adapt, still survive. And this was not a story about reaching the moon. It was a story about restraint, about humility, about understanding that progress is not a straight line forward, but a fragile balance between ambition and respect for reality. And three men went into space believing they were explorers. They returned as proof that intelligence, teamwork, and calm under pressure are stronger than the vacuum of space itself. The mission failed by every original objective, yet succeeded in something far more important. And it showed that technology alone is never enough. Machines break, systems fail. Plans collapse. What remains is the human mind, imperfect, creative, relentless. And in the silence between stars where no help was coming, they learned the oldest lesson humanity has ever known. Survival does not belong to the strongest, but to those who adapt when everything they trusted disappears. Then somewhere beyond Earth's atmosphere, pieces of that broken spacecraft still orbit, silent witnesses to the moment when failure became legend, when loss transformed into knowledge, when three lives hung between equations and courage drifting through darkness, carried not by certainty, but by the refusal to give up, moving through space guided by numbers, faith, and the quiet belief that even when the universe turns against you, the mind can still find a way forward, calculating, adjusting, enduring, pressing on. Through the cold, through the fear, through the unknown, trusting that motion itself, however fragile, could still carry them home. And the calculations did not stop when they were declared safe. Survival did not end at splashdown. Long after the capsule cut through the atmosphere and struck the ocean, the questions kept moving forward like debris that never truly burns up. What exactly had failed, why it failed, and how close the margin truly was between history remembered as a miracle and history remembered as a warning. And inside the spacecraft, nothing looked heroic. It looked broken, panels scorched, systems powered down to near death. The environment inside had been closer to a freezer than a cockpit. Their bodies had weakened, muscles stiffened. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by cold noise and the constant awareness that one wrong calculation would mean the end. Space does not kill loudly. It kills quietly, patiently waiting for a small oversight. And what kept them alive was not bravery in the cinematic sense. There were no speeches, no dramatic defiance shouted into the void. There was procedure, discipline, the ability to focus on the next step when the future felt impossible to imagine. Fear was present, but it was managed, boxed away, acknowledged without being allowed control. That restraint mattered more than courage. And on Earth, the same restraint ruled the rooms filled with engineers and flight controllers. They did not celebrate small victories. They did not panic over setbacks. They moved forward inch by inch, aware that optimism without accuracy could be fatal. Every decision was tested against physics, not hope. Space is honest in that way. It exposes exaggeration instantly. And the explosion that began it all was not the result of a single dramatic mistake. It was the product of complexity, of systems layered upon systems, of assumptions built quietly into designs, a wire here, a test there, a procedure that worked 99 times and failed once. Progress had created a machine so advanced that understanding it fully became a challenge in itself. And this was the hidden cost of exploration. As technology grows more powerful, failure becomes less visible but more dangerous. The margin for error shrinks, the consequences grow. The belief that mastery equals safety becomes the most dangerous assumption of all. And up there, drifting between worlds, the astronauts were forced to confront that truth directly. They had trained for fires, depressurization, computer failures. They had not trained for this exact sequence, because no one ever trains for the exact way reality decides to break. Training gives you tools, not answers. Survival depends on how you combine them when the script ends. And the lunar module, now a lifeboat, was never meant to be powered down and restarted in the way they were forced to attempt. Batteries had limits, temperatures had limits, human endurance had limits. Restarting systems after days of near-freezing darkness required a sequence so precise that a single mistake could overload circuits and end everything. There was no reset button, there was no practice run. And so the instructions came carefully, slowly, each step weighed against the others. Switches were flipped not out of habit, but out of calculation. Power was rationed like oxygen. Time itself became a resource measured not in hours, but in tolerances. And the public saw rescue. Those inside lived a negotiation. And every moment raised questions that had no comforting answers. What if the heat shield cracked more than expected? What if the angle of re-entry was too steep or too shallow? What if the guidance system, starved of power for days, misfired at the final moment? There was no redundancy left to fall back on, and yet within that uncertainty there was motion. Forward motion, controlled motion, the kind that defines human progress more honestly than triumph ever could. Because this was not conquest. This was recovery, and the mission forced a reckoning that extended far beyond the spacecraft. It reshaped how systems were tested, how failures were imagined, how humility was built back into design. The idea that success was proof of invulnerability was replaced with something quieter and more durable. Respect for what could still go wrong, and space exploration did not pause after this. It continued, but with a deeper awareness that every mission carries invisible risks waiting for the wrong alignment of conditions. The disaster did not discourage ambition, it refined it. And for the astronauts, life after the mission carried a strange duality. They were celebrated, but they had lived through a version of reality that few could fully grasp. They had floated through silence, knowing that no one could reach them in time if things turned worse. That knowledge changes perspective. It shrinks trivial concerns. It sharpens attention on what truly matters. And they did not return with stories of glory, but with an understanding of fragility. Not just the fragility of machines, but of assumptions. The assumption that progress moves cleanly forward. The assumption that intelligence guarantees control. The assumption that preparation eliminates uncertainty. And what saved them was not perfection, it was adaptability. The ability to discard expectations and work with what remained. That lesson echoes far beyond spaceflight. It applies to any system pushed to its limits. Any endeavor that mistakes success for immunity. And in the end, the mission became a reference point not for failure, but for response. For how humans behave when stripped of convenience, when forced to confront consequences without escape. It revealed a pattern repeated throughout history. Crisis does not create character, it exposes it. And in somewhere between Earth and the Moon, in that narrow corridor where physics dominates and ego dissolves, three men experienced the purest form of that exposure. No audience, no applause, just problems demanding solutions and silence waiting for mistakes. And the universe did not bend for them, it did not offer mercy. It simply allowed them to pass, because their calculations were precise enough, their cooperation steady enough, their attention disciplined, enough to align briefly with the laws that govern everything. And that alignment is rare, temporary, and always conditional. And even now, long after the debris has scattered, and the headlines have faded, the story continues to move quietly through engineering manuals, training rooms, and the collective memory of exploration. Not as a victory lap, but as a reminder written in numbers and near misses. And because somewhere in the machinery of progress, the same question always waits. Not whether something can go wrong, but whether those responsible will recognize the warning signs before silence takes over, before confidence outruns caution, before the margin disappears again, drifting unnoticed into the dark, carrying with it the fragile weight of human lives, balanced once more between precision and consequence, moving forward not with certainty, but with careful intention, aware that survival is never guaranteed, only calculated moment by moment, decision by decision, suspended between what was planned and what remains possible, and suspended between what was planned and what remains possible. That space, that narrow margin, is where the true story lives. Not in the launch footage, not in the applause, but in the quiet realization that control is always temporary. Systems age, assumptions decay, confidence erodes faster than metal when exposed to reality. And the engineers who studied the wreckage did not see a single villain. They saw a chain. Decisions made years earlier, each one reasonable on its own, each one justified by previous success. A material rated safe, a test interpreted as acceptable. A deviation documented then forgotten. Complexity has a way of hiding danger in plain sight, wrapping risk in familiarity, until it no longer looks like a threat. And in space, there is no room for hidden debt. Every shortcut eventually demands payment. The universe does not negotiate. It does not forgive oversight because intentions were good. It simply responds. And what made this mission different was not that something failed, but that failure arrived in a way that forced everyone involved to confront how fragile certainty really is. The astronauts could not rely on automation. The ground teams could not rely on procedure alone. They had to understand the system at a fundamental level to reason through first principles, stripping away assumptions, until only reality remained. And that process was slow and unforgiving. Every idea had to be questioned. Every solution had to survive scrutiny. Creativity was allowed, but only if it obeyed physics. There was no room for ego, no attachment to how things were supposed to work. Only how they actually worked mattered, and inside the capsule time distorted. Days blended together, marked not by sunrise or sunset, but by checklists and rationing. Hunger was managed, thirst was controlled, discomfort became background noise. The real strain was cognitive, the constant need to stay sharp when exhaustion pulled in the opposite direction. And mistakes did not announce themselves. They waited quietly, hiding in the gaps between actions. A switch flipped too early, a sequence executed out of order. A calculation off by a fraction, any one of them could cascade into silence. And the astronauts understood that risk intuitively. They did not rush. Speed was the enemy, precision was survival. Even as their bodies weakened, their attention narrowed, focused entirely on the present moment. Not on what could happen, not on what had already gone wrong, but on what needed to be done next. And that mindset mirrored what was happening on the ground. Teams rotated in shifts, carrying the problem forward like a relay. No single person owned the solution. It emerged from collaboration, from disagreement, from relentless verification. Ideas were tested, rejected, rebuilt. Authority came from accuracy, not rank. And this was not innovation born of inspiration. It was innovation born of constraint. When resources are unlimited, inefficiency hides easily. When resources are scarce, every choice reveals its cost. The crisis stripped the system down to essentials and forced everyone to confront what truly mattered. And the public narrative later simplified it into a rescue. But those involved knew it was more fragile than that. At several points, survival balanced on margins so thin they could not be measured with confidence. There were moments when the best option was simply the least dangerous one available. And re-entry approached not as a climax, but as another problem to be managed. Heat, angle, timing, communication. Each variable interacted with the others. There was no guarantee that the shield stressed and compromised would perform as designed. There was no way to test it, only to commit, and silence during re-entry lasted longer than expected. Longer than procedures predicted. Each second stretched heavy with implication. No one spoke because there was nothing useful to say. The absence of information became its own signal, ambiguous and unforgiving. And when communication finally returned, it did not erase what had happened. It confirmed survival, but it also confirmed how close failure had been. Relief arrived alongside unease, because now the question was unavoidable. If this could happen here under these conditions, it could happen again. And that realization reshaped everything that followed. Redundancies were re-examined. Testing protocols expanded. Scenarios once considered too unlikely to plan for were dragged into the light. Not because fear demanded it, but because understanding did. And the mission became a case study not in disaster, but in response. In how humans behave when systems fail and certainty collapses. It revealed that progress depends less on flawless execution and more on the ability to recover intelligently when flaws appear. And the astronauts returned changed not by trauma alone, but by perspective. They had seen how thin the barrier is between function and failure. How quickly normal becomes critical. How little separates routine from catastrophe when complexity is involved. And that knowledge followed them into every room they entered afterward. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, persistent shaping, how they listened, how they evaluated risk, how they spoke about confidence. They understood that bravery without humility is just another liability. And the spacecraft itself became an artifact studied not for its success, but for its weaknesses. Burn marks told stories, fractures mapped timelines. Every scar was a data point, a reminder that systems communicate long before they collapse, if someone is paying attention. And that may have been the most enduring lesson. Failure rarely arrives unannounced, it whispers first. In anomalies dismissed as noise, in deviations labeled acceptable, in warnings that conflict with expectations, and the universe had issued its warning. Loud enough to be heard, clear enough to be understood. The question was whether that understanding would endure beyond memory. An exploration continued, but the tone changed. Confidence remained, but it was tempered. The belief in progress was no longer blind. It carried with it an awareness of cost, of trade-offs, of responsibility. And because space does not reward optimism, it rewards accuracy. It does not care how advanced a system is, only whether it obeys the rules that govern everything. Those rules cannot be bent by ambition. They can only be respected or ignored. And in the dark between worlds, where rescue is impossible and delay is fatal, that distinction becomes absolute. For a brief moment in history, human lives traced that boundary not as conquerors, but as participants in a negotiation with reality itself. One calculation at a time, one decision layered upon the next, moving forward through uncertainty, aware that survival is not a destination, but a process unfolding continuously as long as attention holds, as long as discipline remains, as long as the fragile balance between knowledge and humility is maintained, drifting onward through the vast indifference of space, carrying with it the quiet understanding that progress is never proven by how far you go, but by how carefully you manage what can still go wrong, and but by how carefully you manage what can still go wrong. That principle does not fade with time. It does not belong only to spaceflight. It follows every complex system humans build, waiting patiently for complacency to invite it back into relevance. And after the mission, simulations were rerun with brutal honesty. Scenarios once dismissed as improbable were explored until they revealed uncomfortable truths. It became clear that success had been teaching the wrong lesson. Each flawless mission before had quietly reinforced the idea that the system was understood, that its behavior was predictable, that risk had been tamed. In reality, risk had only been deferred, and complex systems do not fail all at once. They drift, they accumulate small imperfections that remain invisible until conditions align. In this case, it took vibration, temperature, timing, and a single command executed in the ordinary course of operations to expose a weakness buried deep inside the design. Nothing extraordinary was required. That was the unsettling part. And the lesson was not that space was dangerous. That had always been known. The lesson was that familiarity breeds blindness. The more often something works, the easier it becomes to stop questioning why it works. And the moment questioning stops, vulnerability begins to grow. And the astronauts had lived inside that vulnerability. They felt it in the way systems responded sluggishly, in the way power budgets tightened, in the way every action carried consequences that could not be undone. They were no longer operators of a machine. They were caretakers of a fragile equilibrium. And sleep deprivation blurred time, hunger dulled sensation. Cold seeped into joints and slowed reflexes, yet clarity was required at every step. There was no margin for emotional decision-making. Panic would waste energy. Hope without verification would invite error. Calm became a tool as essential as any instrument panel. And the guidance system, deprived of its normal references, had to be aligned manually using stars that drifted unpredictably across the window. But condensation obscured visibility. Ice crystals floated like debris. Improvisation was necessary, but it had to be controlled improvisation bounded by understanding. Guesswork was not allowed, and on the ground engineers faced a mirrored challenge. They could not see the spacecraft directly. They relied on telemetry that was incomplete, delayed, sometimes misleading. They had to reconstruct reality from fragments, building mental models and testing them against limited data. When a theory failed, it was discarded without sentiment. And this relentless feedback loop between hypothesis and correction defined the rescue. It was not a single breakthrough. It was 1,000 small adjustments, each one reducing uncertainty by a fraction. Progress measured not in leaps but in stability, and the mission exposed a deeper truth about technology. The more advanced it becomes, the more it demands from the people who depend on it. Automation reduces workload, but it also distances operators from the underlying mechanics. When automation fails, understanding must fill the gap instantly. If that understanding has eroded, failure accelerates. And in that sense, the crisis was not only mechanical, it was cognitive. It tested whether the knowledge embedded in the system still lived in the minds of those responsible for it. In this case, it did, barely, and that survival reinforced a cultural shift. Training evolved. Emphasis moved toward understanding over memorization. Procedures were still vital, but they were framed as tools, not crutches. Because when the unexpected happens, procedure alone cannot save you. Only comprehension can. And the spacecraft's journey became a moving classroom, demonstrating in real time how theory collides with reality. Every workaround taught something new about limitations, about interactions that had never been fully explored. The mission generated knowledge precisely because it broke assumptions. And that knowledge spread outward, influencing design philosophies far beyond aerospace. Redundancy was redefined. Testing became more adversarial. Designers began asking not only whether a system worked, but how it would fail and how visible that failure would be when it mattered most. And the astronauts themselves became symbols, but not of heroism in the traditional sense. They represented endurance without spectacle, discipline without drama. Trust built not on certainty, but on shared responsibility. They survived not because they were extraordinary individuals, but because they functioned as part of a system that still allowed human judgment to matter. And that distinction is subtle but critical. When systems are built to eliminate human input entirely, they also eliminate human recovery. The mission underscored that flexibility is not inefficiency, it is resilience. And as time passed, the story was retold, compressed into sound bites and summaries. The tension softened, the fear became abstract, but the underlying dynamics remained unchanged. Complexity continued to increase, systems grew more interconnected. Margins continued to shrink, and the question raised by the mission never truly left. How do you design for failure without accepting it as inevitable? How do you push boundaries without forgetting the cost of crossing them? And the answer was not found in optimism, it was found in vigilance. In continuous skepticism, in the willingness to challenge success as aggressively as failure. Because success is persuasive. It convinces people that what worked yesterday will work tomorrow even when conditions change. And in the silence of space, there is no reward for past performance. Only current accuracy matters. That reality strips away narratives and leaves only outcomes. And the spacecraft's damaged components eventually burned up or sank into the ocean, but their influence persisted. They reshaped conversations about responsibility, about oversight, about the invisible consequences of small decisions, made under the assumption that nothing would go wrong. And that is perhaps the most unsettling legacy. Not that disaster was narrowly avoided, but that it required a crisis to reveal how close the system already was to the edge. The warning signs existed. They simply blended into the background of routine. And the astronauts had felt that edge personally, not as an abstract risk, but as a constant presence. They had watched gauges drift, heard unfamiliar noises, felt the temperature drop. Each sensation reinforced the same message: stability is provisional. And that awareness does not fade easily. It follows you into quieter moments, into future decisions, into any situation where complexity tempts confidence. It encourages pause. It encourages verification. It encourages respect for forces that do not care about intent. And the mission did not end when the capsule was recovered. It continued in design rooms, in training simulators, in conversations shaped by caution rather than excitement. It became a reference point for what happens when preparation meets the unexpected, and refuses to surrender. And in the broader arc of exploration, it marked a transition, a reminder that reaching outward requires equal attention inward, to the systems we trust, to the assumptions we carry, to the limits we prefer not to acknowledge, and because the universe does not adapt to human ambition. Humans must adapt to the universe. That adaptation is never complete. It is an ongoing process of learning, revising, correcting. A process measured not by how far technology advances, but by how honestly its risks are confronted. And somewhere beyond the atmosphere, the trajectory traced by that crippled spacecraft still echoes as an equation solved under pressure, a path chosen not for elegance but for survival. A reminder that progress is not a straight ascent, but a series of corrections, each one responding to forces larger than ourselves, each one demanding attention, humility, and the willingness to accept that certainty is always temporary, that control is borrowed, that every system, no matter how refined, exists in negotiation with reality, moving forward only as long as that negotiation remains balanced, deliberate, and aware of everything that could still unravel if vigilance slips even for a moment.